He broke out of custody during a government transport. No one ordered him. No one helped him. They called it a containment breach. They called him unstable. But under the worst rain this town had seen in years, he clawed his way back to the only place he remembered, the doorstep of a blind girl who never stopped waiting. They tried to erase him. They tried to erase her. They failed. Before tonight is over, you'll understand. Sometimes the most dangerous truth isn't what you see, it's what never leaves your side. If this story pulls something deep inside you, stick around. Hit like if you feel it. Subscribe if you're ready for what comes next. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and which moment made you stop breathing for just a second. The town of Marlow Ridge had a way of holding its breath in the early morning. Light filtered through the willow trees that lined the quiet sidewalks. The kind of golden softness that seemed borrowed from old postcards. It was the kind of place where people still waved from porches, where bicycles leaned against white fences, and where time sometimes forgot to pass. But that stillness, that illusion of normalcy, was broken the day Lena returned from the hospital. She was 10, small, fragile. Fragella had taken both her silent. She hadn't spoken since, not a word. Not to her therapists, not to the soft-voiced teachers who came to the house. Not even to her father, Dean. He'd tried everything. Music boxes that played her mother's favorite lullabies. Books with raised letters. Even a piano tuner who claimed music could heal grief. Nothing broke through. She spent most of her days curled up on the worn couch near the bay window. The one that used to look out into her mother's garden. Now, all it offered Lena was warmth from the sun and the steady hum of life outside. And yet, something changed the day the dog appeared. It wasn't theirs. No one in the neighborhood had ever seen it before. A large black shepherd with deep amber eyes that seemed to glow even in the shade. No collar, no tags. It stood at the bottom of the steps and simply waited. For hours, Dean found it odd. He tried to shoo it away, even called animal control. But when Lena, for the first time in months, reached for her cane and slowly walked out the door toward she knelt down, her hand trembling, and touched the dog's muzzle. Her fingers traced the shape of its ears, its thick fur, and then settled under its chin. Shallow. Dean gasped. He hadn't heard that voice so soft and cracked in nearly 8 months. But she didn't speak to him, only to the dog. Over the next few days, it became a ritual. The dog would return, always around the same time, always silent. And Lina would sit with it for hours, whispering stories no one else could hear. Her hand rested gently on its back. Her face tilted as if seeing with her years. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Dean quietly weep in the hallway. But what no one else noticed, at least not yet, was how the dog always positioned itself. Its ears perked, its back to the street, its body coiled like a spring as if guarding her, as if expecting something. 2 weeks after Shadow began visiting, Officer Lane, a local cop with a kind heart and a terrible poker face, arrived at Dean's house. He looked nervous, fidgety. He asked to speak to Dean privately. The words came slowly, heavily. "There's you?" A related incident. That night there was another crime. A robbery, same intersection, same time, different car. We think Lena might have seen something, or someone. Dean looked back into the house, toward the living room where his daughter sat on the floor, stroking the silent dog's fur. "She's blind," he said quietly. He wasn't. Not before the crash. That night, Dean stayed up reviewing every article, every police note he could find. The robbery had gone wrong. A man had been shot. A suspect had fled the scene and vanished. Witnesses were unreliable. But Lena, she'd been there. The next morning, a detective from out of town came by. Sharp-suited, cold-eyed. He introduced himself as Mason, said he was with Internal Affairs. That caught Dean off guard. Mason didn't ask about Lina's health. He asked about the dog. "Where did it come from?" he asked. "We don't know," Dean replied. "She named him Shadow." The detective's jaw twitched. He made a note. "Keep him close," he said, voice low, unreadable. "And call me if anything strange happens." The moment he left, Dean checked the street. No car, no one, but the hairs on his arms stood up. By nightfall, Shadow was pacing the living room. Not restless but alert. Lena tilted her head as if listening, then she turned to her father and said something that sent a chill down his spine. Shadow says the man with the leather gloves is coming back. Dean didn't sleep that night. Dean had never been a man of rituals, but ever since Shadow arrived, his mornings had fallen into a pattern. Boil water, pour coffee, then quietly stand at the edge of the hallway, listening to the strange, sacred silence between his daughter and the dog. Today, that silence was broken by a knock. Dean opened the door to find Officer Lane again, but this time he wasn't alone. A younger man stood behind him, tall, composed, in full uniform with a leash wrapped loosely around one gloved hand. At the other end of the leash stood a canine, a German shepherd that looked eerily familiar. "Dean," Lane started, glancing at the man beside him. "This is Officer Cruz from State Canine Division. He's here as part of a specialized support program. He brought someone who might help." Dean blinked. "That's Shadow?" Lane shook his head. "No, this is Cruz's dog. His name is also Shadow." Cruz's voice cut in, calm and clear. "Registered as K9 1176, call sign Shadow. He's trained for trauma support and witness protection." The dog didn't bark, didn't move, just stood, still as a statue, eyes sharp and unreadable. Dean hesitated, glanced over his shoulder. "She's in the living room, but I..." "Let him try," Cruz said. The floor creaked as they entered, Shadow's nails ticking rhythmically against the hardwood. Lena sat by the window, hands folded, head tilted slightly. She didn't flinch at the footsteps, but something in her posture shifted the moment Shadow stepped into the room. As if she felt a pull, her chin lifted, her breathing hitched, and then, slowly, deliberately, she moved. It was the first time she'd stood without prompting in weeks. Dean's breath caught in his throat. Her hands reached out, trembling slightly, and Shadow, without a word from Cruz, took a step forward. He lowered his head just enough for her fingers to find the soft fur behind his ears. Her palm flattened, exploring. Her fingers traced his ear, the curve of his head, the width of his shoulders. She pressed her forehead gently against him. "You came back," she whispered. Cruz glanced at Dean, puzzled, but said nothing. Then something unexpected happened. Shadow, he curled beside Lina, eyes closing, exhaling as though relieved. His body pressed against her leg. Not a protective stance. Something deeper, familiar, submissive, as if saying, "I'm here. Tell me." Dean stepped back, overcome, unsure if he was witnessing a miracle or a memory. Lina spoke again, voice clearer this time. "He remembers." Cruz frowned. He's never met her before. But Lina shook her head. "No, this Shadow, this is the same." And then she began to talk. She described the scent of burning rubber, the sound of a man's voice cursing, the scrape of metal. She remembered someone running. He had a limp, she said, her hand tightening on Shadow's fur. His breath smelled like gunpowder and mint. Cruz knelt, pulling a small recorder from his pocket, signaling Dean to stay quiet. Lina continued. "He wore gloves, leather, and there was a click," Cruz prompted gently. Like when someone cocks a gun?" Cruz's expression shifted. That detail wasn't public. Dean saw it in his eyes. "Someone lied," Cruz said simply, "or wanted it buried." Lane stepped forward, his face pale. She shouldn't have known that detail. The gloves, the click, no press report included that. "That's because," Cruz said carefully, "the only people who knew were 2 detectives and the shooter." Dean's stomach twisted. So she really is the only witness. He remembered something too. Later that night, Dean sat in the doorway of Lina's room, watching her sleep for the first time with a sense of peace on her face. Shadow lay curled at her side, like a sentinel, but more than that, a bridge to a truth buried by silence and fear. Downstairs, Cruz made a call from the front porch. His voice low, he confirmed the detail, with a witness statement and an emotional anchor. "But there's more." Shadow responded like he's met her before. Not similar energy, recognition. "That shouldn't be possible unless..." He trailed off. The person on the other end asked something. Cruz hesitated. "Yes, I'll look into the adoption records, but if what I think is true..." He saps flicked back to the upstairs window, where the silhouette of a girl and a dog formed a shape too precise to be coincident. You've been keeping this dog away from the one person who might unlock everything." Inside, Lena stirred in her sleep. Shadow's eyes opened, scanning the room, still, then they fixed on the door, and just for a second, his ears twitched, as if something outside had shifted. Something familiar, something. The morning after Shadow's visit felt different. Not lighter, not darker, just suspended, like the pause between the breath and the exhale. Lena sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her fingers sifting through her mother's old scarf collection without seeing, her movements slow and absent-minded. Shadow lay close beside her, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but attentive. Dean watched from the kitchen doorway, silently praying she would speak again. She did, but not to him. Her voice came soft, barely brushing the edges of the air. "Once," he began, "there was a man who wore a heavy coat that smelled like thunder." Dean stilled. Cruz, who had returned that morning to follow up, raised an eyebrow. "She means gunpowder," he whispered. Lina continued, almost dreamlike. "He didn't walk like other men. One leg made a different sound, like thud shuffle, thud shuffle." Her fingers paused over a faded burgundy scarf. "He stood outside the car for a long time, breathing hard. I could hear it through the glass." Cruz took out his recorder again, careful not to interrupt her flow. He opened the door with gloves, leather ones. "I remember the squeak, and..." At that exact moment, Shadow rose abruptly. He paced once in a small circle, then stopped and dragged one of his claws across the wooden floor. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. The sound was shrill, scraping. Cruz's eyes narrowed. "What the hell was that?" Dean looked stunned. "He's never done that before." "He has," Cruz said, kneeling beside the dog. "During explosives training, that was his alert sign for gun residue." Lina tilted her head. "I said fire. Was that it, Shadow?" The dog growled low. Not aggressive, but deliberate, focused. Then he returned to her side and placed his chin gently on her knee. "He knows," she whispered. Cruz stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just recall, this is a response. She speaks, he reacts. It's not conditioning, it's memory alignment." Cruz frowned. "You mean he's validating what she says?" "I mean," Cruz said, voice taut, "that this dog was at that scene. Somehow, some way, that's the only explanation for that level of synchronized detail. Smell triggers, vocal keywords. She's not just remembering, she's unlocking him." Dean sat heavily on the armrest of the couch, trying to piece together what felt like a surreal puzzle. But how? How could she know a phrase like, "make it count"? How could she describe the gait of a man she never saw? Cruz didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Cruz. K9 1176 is demonstrating confirmed sensory triggers on testimony from the subject. Yes, gunpowder, gait irregularity. Keyword phrases. I think we need access to the archive." Pause. "No, not digital. The off-books one. The pre-trainer batch." Another pause. "Because this dog wasn't just a trauma support unit. He was field assigned before the department pulled him." The voice on the other end barked something sharp. Cruz responded quickly. "I don't care what the classification tag says, this is real, and she's remembering too much for this to be coincidence." He hung up, jaw clenched. "We're not supposed to know this, but Shadow wasn't always assigned to therapy. He was reclassified 3 years ago. Quietly. No partner, no report. Just pulled from field duty and sent into behavioral rehab." Dean blinked. "Why?" "Something went wrong," Cruz muttered. "But the files were sealed. If we can match her testimony to his old deployment records, we might get an ID on this man." He turned to Lina again. "Do you remember anything else about his voice? Accent, age?" Lina was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she said, "He smelled like storm and mint, like fear pretending to be calm." Shadow let out a single sharp bark. Cruz and Dean both jumped. Lina didn't flinch. "You smelled that too, didn't you?" she said, her hand sliding across Shadow's neck, tracing the faint outline of an old scar. "I knew it." Outside, the sky had begun to shift. "I think she interrupted something bigger than a robbery. And I think someone out there knows it." Dean leaned forward. "Then what do we do?" Before Cruz could respond, Shadow suddenly stood up. Not alert, not curious. Ready. His ears pinned, his stance rigid, his eyes fixed on the front door. Cruz moved first, stepping slowly toward the window, his hand hovering over his. "He's back," she said, her voice flat. "I remember that engine. It hums like a low growl." Cruz dropped to a crouch and reached into his jacket, pulling out a compact radio. "This is Cruz. Possible recon outside 114 Camden. Request backup, unmarked, no sirens." The radio crackled. "ETA 5 minutes. Shadow didn't move from the doorway. His tail was stiff, hackles raised, his body a coiled spring of tension. Lina stood slowly, one hand on the dog's neck. "Don't open the door," she said quietly. "You'll try again, but not the same way." Dean backed up, pulse hammering. What does she mean, try what? Lina didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Shadow and whispered something no one could hear. The dog blinked once, then turned and stared at Cruz, as if waiting. Cruz swallowed hard. He's following her lead now. That means something's coming. The radio crackled again. "Unit en route." Cruz whispered, "Let's hope it's not too late." The tension in the house hadn't faded. It had simply changed temperature, from a simmering unease to a cold, calculated fear. Shadow still hadn't moved from the front door, his eyes locked on the street even after the car had driven away minutes earlier. Lina, however, had gone eerily calm, almost too calm. She returned to her spot on the floor, crossing her legs as if resuming a ritual. Her fingers slid along the wood until she found the dust by the baseboard, then dipped 2 fingers into it and began to draw slowly, silently, with intent. Dean, now pacing anxiously in the kitchen, barely noticed until he heard Cruz exhale sharply. "What is she drawing?" Dean asked, stepping closer. Cruz knelt beside her, eyes narrowing as the lines took form. A looping curve, a circle, a shape that twisted like a coil. And then, "It's not random," Cruz muttered. "That's a tattoo." Dean's stomach dropped. "A tattoo?" "Not just any tattoo," Cruz added, standing. "That symbol, I've seen it before. It's from an internal intelligence report. We weren't supposed to keep copies, but..." His voice trailed off as he stared at Lina, who had now finished the sketch and was sitting motionless, her fingers pressed gently into the tail of the drawn serpent. "You does it mean?" Dean pressed. Cruz hesitated, clearly weighing what could be said. "It's a mark, used by an internal ring of corrupt officers suspected of trafficking stolen firearms. There were investigations, but most of the files were redacted. Someone high up wanted them gone fast." Dean stepped back like he'd been punched. "And now she's drawing it from memory?" Cruz nodded. "That group, they called themselves the Coil." He turned to Lina. "Where did you see this, sweetheart?" Lina didn't answer with words. Instead, she lifted her hand and placed her palm flat against Shadow's shoulder, just below the neck. Cruz looked puzzled, until she spoke again, barely audible. "He had it here." She tapped the same spot on Shadow's body. "The man, the one with the limp." Cruz paled. "A shoulder tattoo." He turned on his heel and walked out onto the porch, pulling his phone from his vest. Dean followed, shaken. "Who are you calling?" "Internal Affairs," Cruz said. "This has to be logged officially now." He pressed the speaker button and waited through the automated clicks. "IA Command, Agent Wilder speaking," came a gravelly voice. "This is Officer Cruz. I have a minor requesting witness protection under unofficial status. I need authorization to reopen cold file 317. 317R is closed and sealed," Wilder replied quickly. "By whose authority?" Cruz countered. A pause, then, carefully, Wilder said, "By the Commissioner's office." Cruz's jaw tightened. "I'm reporting new evidence. A confirmed coil mark described by a minor witness, with responsive behavior from K9 1176. You need to hear this, Cruz." Wilder's tone shifted. "Don't dig into this. Not with a civilian. Not with a kid. I'm telling you as a friend." He ended the call without a word, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Dean's voice broke the silence. "He told you to back off, didn't he?" Cruz nodded grimly, which means she just drew the truth. They walked back inside together, the air thick with tension. Lina was still sitting beside the drawing, gently tracing it over and over, like a loop. Shadow sat beside her now, eyes flicking between the dusted floor and the door again. Dean crouched beside her, voice cracking slightly. "Sweetheart, how did you know to draw that?" Lena tilted her head. He took off his jacket when he reached into the trunk. I heard the zipper, and the coat, it smelled like smoke and oil. I was scared, so I counted the steps he took, 5 to the back, 4 to the side, 1 thud, then silence, and I heard fabric move. I heard it brush his arm. Then, her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. It was too steady, too exact. Dean looked at Cruz, his face pale. She remembers the rhythm of a killing. That night, Cruz typed a full report, but before he submitted it, he hesitated. Then he encrypted it, labeled it under a false training exercise, and saved a copy to an external drive. He didn't trust the department's server, not anymore. The next morning, a black SUV idled 2 blocks from the house. Unmarked, silent. Cruz noticed it first from the window while sipping burnt coffee. He said nothing and waited. Later that day, when he tried to access the 317, he made another call, this time to a former partner who owed him favors. The kind you don't speak of in daylight. I need eyes on the commissioner's archive logs, he said. Yesterday morning to now. I need to know who touched 317. Jesus, Cruz, you're trying to get yourself buried? No, Cruz said. I'm trying to keep a 10-year-old girl from disappearing. Back at the house, Lena stood barefoot in the backyard, hand lightly touching Shadow's head. The dog hadn't barked since the car the night before, but his body remained taut, alert, like a wire stretched too tight. Lena turned toward the woods behind the house, the ones no one went into anymore. He's there, she said. Dean, who was raking leaves nearby, dropped the handle. Who, baby? The one who wore the gloves. He's waiting again. Dean stared into the trees, but saw only shadows, the kind that move when you don't look directly at them. That evening, Cruz returned from his makeshift command post, Cruz said, pointing. Was part of a special unit disbanded 2 years ago. Used to run undercover narcotics raids. Quiet type. Limped from a warehouse explosion. What's his name? Dean asked. Cruz's voice was low but steady. Detective Julian Maris. Last assigned right here in Marlow Ridge. Dean's knees gave out. He dropped into the nearest chair. I knew him. He trained with me. He used to bring his daughter to our backyard barbecues. Cruz nodded. He vanished 6 months before the accident. Presumed dead. But no body, no death certificate. And guess what? He slid another document across the table. Maris had the same tattoo. Same placement, right shoulder. We have a problem. Before Dean could respond, the lights in the living room flickered once, then again, and from upstairs Shadow growled. By dawn, Cruz had barely slept. His mind kept looping through the documents, the sealed files, and the unmarked car that had parked outside the house for nearly 20 minutes the night before. The face of Julian Maris haunted him. Not Cruz sipped bitter coffee in Dean's kitchen, eyes fixed on the yard where Lina and Shadow stood together in silence, her fingers combing slowly through the dog's thick fur. The girl hadn't spoken since the night before, but her stillness had meaning now, a kind of focused grief laced with knowing. Cruz's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. Cruz. The voice on the other end was clipped and precise. K91176 has been reassigned. Immediate relocation. Transport en route. Cruz blinked. Excuse me, who authorized that? Office of Tactical Command. Directive came through this morning, non-negotiable. That dog is in the middle of an active witness interaction. We're building a case. He's not your asset anymore, officer. Stand down. Final location is classified. The line went dead. Cruz stared at the phone in disbelief. Then at Shadow, still at Lina's side, tail flicking gently as if sensing something distant approaching. Dean stepped in from the living room. What's wrong? Cruz didn't answer at first. He walked out slowly, knelt beside Lina and whispered, Sweetheart, I need to talk to your dad for a second, okay? Lina turned her face toward him, eyes blank but unnervingly sharp. She didn't move, didn't speak. Shadow leaned into her, sensing the shift. Cruz stepped back and gestured Dean over. They're taking him, he said quietly. What? Shadow just got the call, immediate reassignment, no appeal, no warning. They're pulling him from the field, because someone up there knows he remembers. and they're afraid of what he might still lead us to. They didn't have time to argue. The transport van showed up within the hour. Unmarked. 2 men, no name tags. They didn't speak as they stepped into the yard. Just held up a tablet with orders. Cruz read them twice. He recognized the encryption signature. He's leaving now? Cruz turned to Shadow, his hand twitching near the holster on his belt. Not out of threat, but instinct. The dog didn't resist, but he didn't approach either. Instead, he looked at Lina, eyes locked yet, still her palm, and gave a low whine. Lina bent down, forehead to his, lips moving without sound. When she stood up, the first tear slipped down her cheek. Dean reached for her shoulder. That was when she screamed. It wasn't a child's wail or a sob of frustration. It was a jagged, broken cry from somewhere deep inside, as if the cords that kept her anchored had finally snapped. "No," she shouted, "he's not done." Her voice cracked mid-word. Her fists clenched tight. "You can't take him. He hasn't finished it. He hasn't shown me all of it yet." The 2 agents froze, exchanging a glance. Dean lunged toward her, pulling her into his arms, but she fought against him, kicking, crying, her face rayed with, "You can't, he knows things I don't yet. He's not done." Shadow stopped in his tracks, ears perked, body tense. Then, before anyone could react, he turned and bolted, not toward the van but back toward Lina. The agent shouted, reaching for the leash, but Shadow ducked, slid beneath one man's legs and bounded across the yard in 3 precise strides. He stopped just short of her and sat, not barking, not running, just refusing. Cruz stepped forward, voice firm but level. "If you try to touch him, you're gonna start a riot. I'm not letting you manhandle a PTSD dog in front of a child who just found her voice." The taller agent stepped forward. "You're obstructing a federal reassignment order." Cruz smiled coldly. "You're impersonating tactical command, so maybe we're both dancing today." The agents didn't argue. But they didn't leave either. They simply backed off to the van, pulled out a phone, and made a call Cruz couldn't hear. Dean was still holding Lina, now trembling against his chest, her voice reduced to whispers. "They can't take him. He's not finished. There's more. He knows something about the glove man, about the house with the red door." Cruz turned sharply. "What house?" Lina didn't lift her head. "I saw it. In the memory. His memory." "Whose memory?" "Shadow's." Cruz crouched beside her. "What red door?" She swallowed hard. "After the man shot someone, for she know what Shadow saw. Because he imprinted," Cruz said. "It happens rarely, when the trauma is high enough, and the connection is pure." He stood up. "We need to find that house, before someone finds it first." Inside, Shadow paced by the window. The van was still there, waiting, watching. Lina sat on the couch, knees pulled tight to her chest, staring blankly ahead. Her face had changed not just from grief, but something older, wiser. Dean stood nearby, phone in hand, unsure who to call. Cruz was in the kitchen, tearing through every local real estate record, every known address tied to Maris. Then, his eyes landed on an old foreclosure listing, a property seized 3 years ago, abandoned, red front door, no follow-up file, no owner reclaimed. "Got you," he whispered. Outside, the van's engines suddenly revved. The agents began walking toward the house again, this time faster. Cruz slammed his laptop shut, rushed to the front door, and threw his badge up. "This is now a protected witness site. You step 1 foot on this property, I file for obstruction and abuse of a minor under trauma therapy protocol. Your move." The agents paused. One of them reached for his badge, not because of Cruz, because of the low growl coming from behind him. Shadow stood in the doorway, his body rigid, eyes glowing with defiance. The message was clear. Lina stepped forward, her small frame trembling, but her voice cut clean through the air. "You don't get to erase him. You don't get to erase me." She reached down and placed her hand gently on Shadow's head. The dog didn't move. He just stared. The tension never fully left the house after the failed attempt to remove Shadow. It simply changed shape, sank deeper into the walls like mold in the foundation. Cruz didn't trust the silence, and neither did Dean. Lina slept with one hand always curled around Shadow's fur, and the dog once reactive only to threat. A black and blue cruiser rolled up slowly to the curb, and a new uniform stepped out. Young, neatly pressed and polite, Officer Blake Rhodes introduced himself as Lina's new protective detail, assigned temporarily due to the recent tensions surrounding the K9 situation. Dean narrowed his eyes. "We didn't request anyone." Cruz appeared at the door, already scanning the man's badge. "Who signed your assignment?" Blake didn't flinch. "Lieutenant Hargrove said it was for safety protocol. One of the IA guys flagged the address after yesterday's standoff." Cruz stepped aside but didn't say a word. The name Hargrove rang hollow with bureaucracy, vague, sterile, convenient. Inside, Lina said nothing when Blake entered, but Shadow did. It happened fast. A low growl, a twitch of the shoulders, and then a lunge. I've never met this dog. Then why is he giving the code red posture?" Cruz demanded. "That stance is only trained into K9 units when identifying internal threat. You've been flagged before." "When?" Blake's jaw twitched, but he held his line. "I was once rotated through tactical for a week, during the trials. He might have seen me there." Cruz turned to Dean. "Get Linus's." Later that afternoon, as Cruz pored over regional traffic cam archives, and Dean tried in vain to contact anyone willing to explain Blake's sudden assignment, Lina sat upstairs with Shadow curled beside her. She was calmer now, but not at ease. Something about Blake's scent had made her flinch. Not the cologne, not the starch. Something underneath. But then his head snapped up. He moved toward the far wall of her bedroom, sniffed once, then twice, then began to scratch at the baseboard. Lina sat upright, her hand pressed against her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. Shadow growled low, then began pawing harder. Lina rose, made her way to him, knelt, and placed her hand on the floor. Cold, uneven, with a slight bulge behind the base trim. Something shifted, a small plastic click, and then she found it. A recorder. Tucked behind the paneling, hidden under what looked like years of dust, but felt placed. Shadow barked once, sharp and direct. Downstairs, Cruz heard it and bolted up the stairs. By the time he reached the room, Lina had already pulled the device free and was holding it like something radioactive. Dean was behind him, white-faced, nothing but static at first. Then voices, distant, muffled. Lina's voice, talking to Shadow, then crying. Then Cruz's own voice, soft, coaxing. The sound of his laptop keys, the sound of their private conversations, recorded, logged out. From inside her room, Cruz's face turned to stone. "This wasn't here yesterday." Dean ran a hand through his hair. "How long's it been recording?" "Long enough," Cruz muttered. "Someone's been feeding intel from inside." He looked at Shadow, then back at the recorder. "And I have a damn good guess who placed it." Downstairs, Blake stood at the window, sipping coffee he hadn't been offered. The street was quiet, but he kept looking at the same spot, the empty patch of curb where the black SUV had parked days ago. He tapped his fingers against the porcelain mug like a metronome. When Cruz returned, he carried the recorder casually, like an afterthought. "Hey Blake, quick question," he said, stepping into the living room. "You were assigned here this morning, right?" Blake nodded. "Roughly 900. Did you use the upstairs bathroom?" No." "You sure?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure. Why?" "Because we found something in the kid's bedroom." Cruz held out the recorder. "Any reason you'd have access to surveillance-grade bugging devices?" Blake's expression shifted just slightly. "Enough? No clue what that is." "You've got 2 seconds to try again," Cruz said, stepping closer. "Because this model, it's IA issue, which means you either planted it, or you're protecting the person who did." Blake's eyes darkened. He set the mug down. "This isn't going to end well for you." "Then let's make it worth the paperwork," Cruz snapped, grabbing the front of his vest. Dean shouted from behind, but Lina had already made her way to the stairs, holding the banister tight, listening with wide eyes. And "No?" This time, he stared past the window, out into the street. At the same van, it was back. This time, no agents stepped out, just silence. Long, unsettling. Then the headlights flicked once, a signal. Cruz released Blake, pushed him backward. "Stay where I can see you." He turned to Dean. "Get her away from the windows." Dean grabbed Lina, but she resisted. "No," she said, her voice suddenly urgent. "It's happening again. I can feel it." Shadow barked twice, fast, clip. Something wasn't right. Not inside. Behind them, behind the street. Cruz's phone buzzed. Anonymous message. 4 words. "Too late, it's inside." The storm rolled in before sunset. Not a polite drizzle, but a brutal, sweeping wall of rain and thunder that pounded the neighborhood with the kind of fury that made windows tremble and dogs howl. Most people stayed indoors. Lights dimmed, televisions up, pretending the weather was just background noise. But in the middle of Maple Street, soaked to the bone, stood a figure that didn't move. A dog, large, black, familiar, Shadow. His fur was plastered against his ribs, his ears pinned back by the wind. But his eyes, those sharp, amber eyes, stayed fixed on a single house, 114 Camden, Lina's house. Hours earlier, Cruz had been forced to make an impossible choice. With mounting pressure from higher-ups and veiled threats laced through every communication, he was ordered to release Shadow from active duty. The official story was health reallocation, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. They were cutting ties. Shadow was removed from the premises, transported to a remote holding kennel for reassignment. But something went wrong, or maybe something went perfectly right. Somewhere between the facility and the redacted location, the crate was found empty. The latch had been forced from the inside. No witnesses, no camera feed, just a single black paw print left in the mud behind the chain-link fence. By the time the facility called Cruz, Shadow was already gone. Dean and Cruz argued in whispers while Lina sat curled on the floor, her hands clenched around Shadow's worn collar, which he had pulled off himself before disappearing. "They'll spill this," Cruz warned. "They'll call him dangerous, say he's rogue. You know how this plays out." Dean's voice cracked, but her fingers moved slowly over the metal tag in her hand, and her lips trembled as she mouthed something too soft to hear. Across the street, in a dim bedroom with posters half peeled off the walls, 13-year-old Zach Myers pressed his phone against the window pane. The thunder rumbled so hard it shook his desk lamp, but he didn't blink. "Guys," he whispered into the TikTok livestream, "you're not gonna believe this. Remember that black dog they tried to take away last week?" He zoomed in. Shadow stood on the porch of the Camden house, his head low, his tail still, his body soaked but perfectly still, facing the door like a soldier awaiting orders. "Dude looks like he's begging to be let in," Zach said, and the chat blew up with comments. Within minutes, the video had been clipped and re-uploaded by 2 local accounts. Within an hour, it was picked up by a viral rescue dog page. Shadow, the loyal canine who escaped detainment to return to a blind girl's home during a thunderstorm, became a symbol. "Let him in," flooded comment sections. Hashtags erupted. "Shadow returns," "Let the dog in." Dean opened the door slowly. The rain splashed against his legs. Thunder cracked above him like a warning. And there, just 2 steps down, she looked up, blinked once, and took a single step forward before sitting, unmoving. Dean dropped to one knee. "They're gonna call you a threat," he murmured. "They're gonna spin you into the villain." Shadow blinked again, and then looked past him, toward Lina. Dean stepped aside. When the dog entered the house, it was like something ancient shifted. Lina lifted her head before anyone spoke. Her hand opened without hesitation, and Shadow was already there, pressing his head into her palm like the moment had never ended. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply breathed deep and slow. "Jesus Christ," he said under his breath, watching the rain-slicked animal pad silently into the room. "He made it back. Alone," Dean added. "Across 20 miles. In a storm," Cruz said. Through 3 search alerts, he shook his head, almost smiling. "They're going to lose their minds." Later that night, Cruz scrolled through his phone and paused on Zach's clip. It now had over 700,000 views. Local news anchors were requesting interviews. One outlet already mocked up a headline: "Blind girl's dog escapes government detention to come home." The tide was turning. Something bigger was happening. People were watching, people were questioning. Dean sat across from him, drying Shadow with a towel, but his voice stayed low. "So now what? Now?" Cruz said. "Now we show them what they tried to bury." He turned to Lina. "Sweetheart, you said something before. About the house, the red door, the smell, the bleach and lemon. Lina nodded. Shadow lifted his head. We need to go there, then whispered. There were papers in the drawer and a box under the bed. The floor creaked on the right side. Cruz was already typing. There's a window too, she added. I think he kept it open. It smelled like rain even when it wasn't raining. Dean looked up. You think she can find it? I think, Cruz said, staring at Shadow. He can. This one didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. The headlights stayed off, the windows remained up, and behind the wheel, someone lifted a phone and slowly pressed record. The courthouse loomed like a giant made of old stone and newer lies. Reporters swarmed the front steps, their microphones sharp and urgent, as if trying to tear pieces from a truth no one was ready to tell. Inside, the air was heavier than the rain still pouring outside. Everything smelled of wet coats, old wood, and anticipation. The kind that claws under your ribs. Cruz stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, eyes locked on the double doors that led into courtroom B. He didn't speak, didn't shift. He just watched. Lina sat on the bench just to the right of the entrance, her pale hands folded on her lap, Shadow curled tightly at her feet. He hadn't moved since they arrived, not even when the bailiff tried to scan them. He simply stared ahead, tense but quiet, as if waiting for a cue only he could hear. Dean paced the hallway like a ghost chasing its own shadow. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't blinked much, and he hadn't let go of the printed photo Cruz gave him that morning. The one showing Julian Maris, now officially listed as subject of interest in connection with the West Harbor firearms case. Case that had been mysteriously buried 3 years ago. What the photo didn't show was the man's scent, but Lina remembered it. Lina could describe it better than any witness ever could. And somehow Shadow remembered it too. The courtroom buzzed as the judge entered, robes trailing like thunderclouds. The audience hushed, the air flattened. This hearing will now proceed, the judge intoned. On the prosecution bench, 3 attorneys in dark suits shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. On the defense side, a single figure sat upright, Detective Julian Maris, clean-shaven, composed, his limp noticeable but controlled, his face unreadable. It was the first time Lina had been in the same room with him since the night of the crash. She didn't need eyes to know where he was. She knew the shape of his silence, the taste of his presence. The lawyer leaned down beside her, voice soft but firm. Lina, I know this is hard, but you're the only one who can connect everything. You've already done so much, but I need you to say it for the record. Can you identify the man who did this? The courtroom stilled. No sound, no creak, no cough, just the ticking of a wall clock trying too hard to act like time was still normal. Lina didn't move. Her breath came shallow. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Dean reached forward instinctively, but Cruz caught his wrist. She shook his head. Let her. She lowered her head. Her fingers slowly reached down, brushed the top of Shadow's head. The courtroom waited, breath held, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. Then, softly, Lina spoke. He smells the same as you. The judge murmurs rippled through the room. The judge blinked. Pardon, young lady? She lifted her chin, her voice steady now. The man sitting there, the one with the limp, he smells the same as that night. Miss Mitchell, the defense attorney, interrupted. With all due respect, the witness is blind. She cannot make a visual identification, and she's trained with a canine who reacts to scent signatures. That dog, he pointed to Shadow, is the reason this child is alive. And that same dog reacted violently the moment it encountered Mr. Maris's scent, outside that house with the red door. This is circumstantial, no? Lina cut in. Her voice cut clean across the noise like a scalpel. It's not. She knelt slowly beside Shadow, placed both hands on his head. Her touch was gentle, but her words were sharp. The first time Shadow ever shook, ever trembled, not from cold, not from injury, was the night that man passed behind our house. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he just froze, and he smells like gunpowder, like rust, like mint trying to hide the metal, and he makes my friend afraid, not the barking kind, the remembering kind. Silence blanketed the courtroom. Even the judge seemed at a loss. The prosecutor took a breath. Lina, are you saying this man, the man you smelled that night, The one who said, "You have one shot, make it count." Cruz locked eyes with Maris, and for a second, just a flicker, the mask slipped. A muscle twitched near the corner of his mouth, and Shadow from across the room let out a low, vibrating growl that rolled through the room like a distant drumbeat. Lina turned toward the judge. "He's the one who put the glove on. The one who opened the trunk. The one who made the metal click." The defense attorney stood. "Objection. None of this is verifiable by forensic standard." The judge raised a hand. "We're not in trial yet. This is an evidentiary hearing, and this testimony changes the scope of the inquiry." Dean finally exhaled. His hands trembled against the wood of the bench. Cruz sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the trembling shoulder of the man across the aisle. Maris said nothing, but his silence had begun to fray. Outside the courthouse, the storm had stopped, but a different kind of pressure hung in the air. The crowd waiting beyond the marble columns held signs now, some hand-drawn, some printed, "Believe Lina, K9 Justice, Smell the Truth." And somewhere in the crowd a child held a tablet with the paused video of Shadow standing in the rain. Back inside, the judge spoke. "In light of the witness's testimony and the corroborative behavior of the K9 officer, I am issuing an order to reopen the West Harbor case under federal supervision. Mr. Maris, you are not under arrest, but you are no longer a free man." Court is adjourned. Gavels echoed, papers shuffled. The crowd outside roared like but inside the small waiting room off the corridor, Lina sat with Shadow pressed to her side, her fingers digging gently into the space behind his ear. "We're not done," she whispered. "There's more. He didn't bury everything." Shadow tilted his head slightly, and outside the window across the courthouse lawn, a second unmarked car pulled away slowly, its backseat occupied by a shadowed figure speaking into a phone. The courtroom's echoes hadn't yet faded when Cruz received the call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was shaky, one of the junior techs from evidence recovery who had been quietly helping him off recorder. "You need to see this," the tech said. "Now, not later, now." 30 minutes later, Cruz stood inside a dimly lit storage room beneath the precinct, rows of lockers humming quietly under flickering fluorescent lights. The tech led him to a gray evidence bin that hadn't been touched in over 2 years, labeled simply, "MISC Personal Effects, WH Case." Cruz opened it carefully, fingers brushing aside gloves, a broken dash camera, a file folder soaked from age and moisture, and then he saw it. A motorcycle helmet, scuffed, matte black inside, tucked into the lining, something glinted faintly under the flashlight. Cruz brought it closer to his face. The odor hit him first, chemical burnt, unmistakable, gunpowder. He froze. "Is this the helmet?" he asked. The tech nodded. "Recovered near the warehouse where Maris went dark. Never matched to any suspect. Wasn't processed because the case was sealed the next day." Back at Dean's house, Lina sat cross-legged beside Shadow, fingers tracing quiet circles on his chest as the rain came back in gentle waves. Cruz entered with the helmet in a sealed bag. He didn't speak, just lowered the bag onto the living room floor and gave a soft whistle. Shadow approached, sniffed once, then paused. His body went rigid, tail locked, eyes narrow. Then he barked. Short, the exact signal for chemical firearm residue. Cruz stared. "That's it. That's the imprint." He glanced at Lina. "Sweetheart, can you smell anything?" She hesitated, moved closer, bent slightly, her nose hovering near the visor. "Like the trunk," she whispered, "like metal and something that hides behind mint." Dean exhaled loudly. "So this is the last thing he wore before shooting someone." The forensic team confirmed it later that night. Residue matched the chemical profile of the ammunition used in the West Harbor incident. The same one Maris was presumed missing in. Shadow had not only remembered the scent, he had led them back to the physical proof. Cruz brought the helmet to the newly reassigned lead on the case, Captain Sorensen, one of the last few names in the department Cruz still trusted, but Sorensen was already ahead of him. "I got something too," he said, pulling out a file. "A few weeks before you took Shadow into the field with Lina, a request was filed to have him permanently retired. Reason, psychological instability. The author." Sorensen turned the page. Cruz read the signature. "Detective Xanthes J.I.'s parade of garland eyes in a sentence." "Exactly," Sorensen said. "But it didn't stick. Because there wasn't enough on paper to prove Shadow was unstable. No incident reports, no bites, just one warning from an internal training exam. "Let me guess," Cruz said darkly. "The examiner was Maris's old partner." Bingo. It all started snapping together like broken glass finding its original shape. Maris had staged the accident, or at least capitalized on the chaos. He used the crash to disappear, to bury the evidence literally and figuratively. But Shadow had been there. He had locked in on the scent. And Lena, through whatever strange bond they shared, had carried that memory forward. Now, they had motive, mean, and most important, proof. The next morning, Cruz drove with Shadow to the site Lena had described weeks ago, the red adored house. It had sat empty since the warehouse raid, marked condemned. But Shadow had no trouble finding the path, through the overgrown grass, past the rusted gate, straight to the porch where the boards creaked beneath their steps. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew, but still something sharper lingered underneath. Shadow moved like he'd been here before. He led Cruz down the hallway, toward a bedroom with faded wallpaper. One sniff, one bark. Cruz opened the closet, a false wall, and behind it, a sealed plastic bin. Inside were boxes of ammo, burner phones, a tactical vest, and a notebook. Cruz opened it slowly. On the first page, a sketched snake curled around a gun. Underneath it, protocol: if exposed, burn and vanish. Use leverage. Silence witnesses. The next few pages were filled with names, officers, locations, payouts. One name caught his eye: Rhodes. Officer Blake Rhodes. "Jesus," Cruz whispered. They were everywhere. Back at the courthouse, the hearing was being rescheduled. But the evidence was piling too fast to wait. Cruz barged into the clerk's office, threw the bin on the desk and said, "We need a federal hand now. Not tomorrow. Not after paperwork. Now." The clerk flinched. "Who do you think you are?" Cruz pulled out his badge. "I'm the guy whose canine just cracked a buried conspiracy with a blind kid's help, and I'm done asking politely." That afternoon, Maris was taken into custody for questioning. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything when Shadow entered the room with Cruz. He stiffened. The dog stared. Didn't grow out, didn't bark, just stared. Cruz leaned in. "He remembered you, and now the whole world will." The internet caught fire. Headlines screamed, "Disgraced officer connected to secret police ring thanks to retired canine." Lena's name stayed out of the press, but her story became a movement. Anonymous accounts posted her quote, "The one who smells just like when he trembles." And just like that, a little girl's memory became the hammer that cracked the stone wall of a hidden network. But as the city buzzed with reaction, Cruz stood in the dark, staring at the helmet now sealed in evidence, and knew it wasn't over. Because on the final page of that notebook, beneath all the names and addresses, was one line that chilled him more than anything Maris had ever done. It said, "If compromised, activate Omega." And in the shadowed corner of the precinct parking lot, a car engine turned over. Headlights flared for a moment, and then went dark again. The courthouse was different this time. It wasn't just the air lighter now, crackling not with fear but with the first electric hum of hope. It was the people too. Faces pressed against the glass doors, strangers and neighbors alike, hands cupping their eyes to catch a glimpse of the girl and the dog who had shaken an entire system. Inside courtroom B, everything gleamed with a strange, anxious brightness. The judge entered, black robes swirling behind him, his eyes sharp and a little red from sleeplessness. He had read the files, he had seen the evidence, and now he was ready to make history. Dean sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his wedding ring digging into his knuckles. He looked thinner, older, but for the first time in over a year there was something in his chest that almost felt like breathing again. Lina sat next to him, her hair neatly braided back, a simple blue dress skimming her knees. Shadow lay at her feet, perfectly still, his ears flicking only once when the bailiff called the room to order. Cruz stood against the back wall, arms crossed, his badge hanging heavy from his belt. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched. The prosecutor rose first. "Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming new evidence, including corroborated forensic links, previously suppressed files, and witness testimony, we move to drop all charges against Mr. Dean Mitchell." Furthermore, we submit formal apology recommendations from the Department for Wrongful Implication and Emotional Distress." The words hung in the air like a held breath. The judge nodded slowly. His gavel came down once, firm, final. "Mr. Mitchell, you are hereby cleared of all suspicion and free to leave without condition. This court recognizes your innocence and the grievous mishandling of your case." Dean's shoulders collapsed inward as if the very gravity had changed around him. He turned slowly to Lina, his eyes filling. She smiled the softest, most breathtaking smile he had ever seen, and reached blindly for his hand. He caught it, and for a moment, it was as if nothing else existed but them. The reporters exploded outside the building, microphones raised, cameras flashing like miniature suns. But inside, it was Lina who rose first. Dean tried to pull her gently back down, whispering, "It's over, baby, you don't have to say anything." But Lina shook her head. She touched the charm hanging from Shadow's collar, her fingers brushing the worn metal, then stepped forward to the front of the courtroom, alone. No script, no coaxing, no prompting. Just her and the truth she had carried for far too long. The judge watched her with a softness that didn't often find its way into these walls. The prosecutors paused mid-packing. Even the bailiff straightened slightly, sensing something bigger was about to happen. Lina stood still for a long moment, hands at her sides, her chin lifted toward the ceiling as if feeling the weight of the room, the people, the centuries of injustice stitched into every corner. When she spoke, her voice was clear, high but firm, threading through the silence like a silver needle. "Justice isn't blind," she said. "It sees, it feels, it remembers. Justice only feels blind to those too afraid to look at the truth." She paused, her small hands tightening into fists at her sides. "It doesn't need eyes, it doesn't need sight. It only needs one thing." She turned her face toward the gallery, toward the reporters, toward the entire country watching now through screens and twits and trembling live streams. "Justice needs someone brave enough to reach out and touch it." The words fell into the silence like pebbles into deep water, rippling outward farther and faster than anyone in the room could track. Cruz bowed his head slightly. Dean clutched the table's edge, tears rolling freely down his cheeks. And somewhere in the crowd, Zach Myers, his phone trembling in his hand, caught it all. In under an hour, the clip would eclipse 1 million views. Shadow rose slowly beside her, pressed his body against her legs like a silent promise. The judge banged his gavel again, softer this time, almost reverent. Court dismissed, but no one moved. No one even breathed for a heartbeat longer. It wasn't just a case closing, it was a door, a wall crumbling, a voice breaking through the noise outside as carried her through the massive courthouse doors. A sea of applause met them, no boos, no accusations, just raw, unfiltered gratitude. Flowers rained from the crowd. Hands clapped until palms stung. Shadow barked once, the sound carrying like a battle cry across the marble steps. Reporters shouted questions, flashes popped, but none of it mattered. Lina turned her face toward the warm sun slicing through the dissipating storm clouds, her braid fluttering in the breeze, and smiled. She couldn't see the light, but she could feel it. She could hear it in the voices around her. She could taste it in the way the air no longer pressed so heavily against her chest. Dean whispered into her ear, voice cracking with awe. "You did it, baby. You brought us back." She shook her head, smiling. "We all did it." Her hand reached down until it found Shadow's fur, and he pressed against her in answer. Together they stepped into the light, and somewhere deep inside the system that had once tried to silence her, somewhere behind locked doors and shredded files, a warning ripple traveled through the darkness. Sometimes it isn't the strongest who tear down walls. Sometimes it's the ones who refuse to be silent, who refuse to stop reaching because justice had never been blind. It had only been waiting for someone brave enough to touch it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey. I'd love to know what was the moment in the story that stayed with you the most, and where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it.